Greetings to all of you from Madras, India. I would like to begin by thanking Professor Mark Soames and the International Neuro-Psychoanalysis Society for inviting me to give this lecture. I feel deeply honored. I wish I could be there in Rome in person. Unfortunately, I can't do this for personal reasons. Therefore, I'm sending you this videotape at the request of Dr. Soames. It was recorded before a live audience. I realize this is a conference attempting to bridge neurology and psychoanalysis, which have traditionally remained quite distinct disciplines. And thanks to scientists and analysts like Professor Mark Soames, we are now beginning to bridge this huge gap that separates neurology on the one hand and psychiatry and psychoanalysis, especially on the other hand. And I'd like to make some attempts to do this. And my own approach to this is from the standpoint of a behavioral neurologist, looking at patients who have sustained injury to small regions of the brain, producing characteristic changes in behavior. And the topic I'd like to take up, which I think most of you have heard of, is what we call denial. Denial of illness, denial of paralysis, which you sometimes see in neurology, called anosognosia, a term that was first coined by the famous French neurologist Babinski. Babinski pointed out that some patients who have a stroke affecting the right hemisphere, you don't see the syndrome very often with left hemisphere stroke. You see it most often with the right hemisphere stroke, especially right frontoparietal strokes, where you have complete paralysis of the left side of the body because of damage to the internal capsule. Most of the time, the patient, of course, complains that his left arm is paralyzed and left leg is paralyzed and asks the physician, when am I going to get better? When am I going to improve? That's what you would expect. But a certain percentage of these patients, as you all know, vehemently deny their own paralysis. They'll say, doctor, my left arm is not paralyzed, it's functioning well. And what's astonishing is the patient is often quite mentally lucid, mentally completely normal in other respects, is not obviously psychotic or deranged in any sense, and yet here's a person who is perfectly intelligent, engaging in fluent conversation with you, and yet when it comes to his own paralysis, denies that he or she is paralyzed. And this is the syndrome described by Babinski and called anosognosia. And just to give you an idea of what this syndrome is and what its implications might be, I'd like to tell you about one or two patients that I've seen recently. But before I do that, let me give you some idea of why I am giving this lecture on anosognosia to a conference on psychoanalysis. And the reason is that, well, let's go back in time to the dawn of psychoanalysis, go back all the way to Freud. And towards the end of his career, Freud, the end of the 19th century, came up with what he called a manifesto for a scientific study of the mind, scientific psychology. And this little known manifesto is well known to all of you psychoanalysts, but it's not widely known among neurologists. And in this manifesto, he proposed that analysis alone is not going to take you very far in understanding the functions of the mind, functions of the brain. Ultimately, you have to look at the actual neural machinery in the brain. This may sound surprising coming from Freud. People usually think of Freud, you think of Oedipus complex, penis envy, this and that, you know. You think of mainly of psychological phenomena or religious belief, totem poles, all aspects of human nature, origins of humor, why people dream. But in fact, Freud, as you all know, began his life as a neurologist. In fact, one of his earliest papers was on the nervous system, dissecting and studying the nervous system of a lamprey, which is a fish-like creature. Now, Freud began his career in anatomy, became disillusioned with anatomy, and then embarked on a whole career of speculation on many aspects of the human mind, such as religion, laughter and humor, all of this. Then he got disillusioned with psychoanalysis and came up with this scientific manifesto for study of the human mind, where he said people have to look at, the time will come when we will study the nervous system and actually find the answers looking at the actual physiology and anatomy of the brain. Now at that time this is hard to do, but what I'd like to argue today in the lecture is, given some of the syndromes we were studying, especially anosognosia, we can actually answer some of the questions Freud raised. And we're in a position now to do what he suggested, to tackle the neurological underpinnings of human nature. Many aspects of human nature which have hitherto remained inaccessible to experiments. So that's my main message today, that you can use this syndrome, anosognosia, to address some of these so-called psychological problems. So let's begin with an actual example. A patient I saw not long ago, I'll call her Mrs. D for convenience, fictitious names, of course. So Mrs. D had a right middle cerebral artery stroke, causing a complete paralysis of the left side of her body. And I went there and I started talking to her, and it was obvious she was a very intelligent lady in her 60s, speaks fluently, she had no aphasia, and mentally was quite lucid, and we did what we call a mini mental status evaluation. It was relatively normal. She was a little bit slowed down, obviously, given the stroke, but overall she was quite normal, could converse fluently. So I said, what is your name? She told me her name, Mrs. D. What do you do for a living? I don't do anything. What does your husband do? She mentioned what her husband does. She told me about her 4 children who are on Catalina Island, what jobs these children held, told me about her grandchildren. Perfectly normal conversation. Then I asked her, what brought you to the hospital? Why are you here? When did you come to the hospital? She said, 2 weeks ago. Why did you come to the hospital? She said, well, I had a stroke. So I said, how do you know that? She said, well, I fell down in my bathroom. My sister brought me to the hospital. They did a brain scan. They told me I had a stroke. And I said, Mrs. D, can you walk? She said, oh, of course I can walk. Now, she has not taken a single step in the last 2 weeks that she's been in the hospital. She's been either in bed or in the wheelchair. Think of the dozens of times she had had to go to the bathroom and had to be assisted, taken there by the staff. Yet she claims, I can walk fine. Then I said, can you use your hands, Mrs. D? And she said, oh, of course I can use my hands. Her left hand has not budged in the last 2 weeks, not the slightest flicker of movement. And yet she's telling me, of course I can move my hand. And then I said, Mrs. D, can you use both your hands? She said, yes, I can use both my hands. Okay. Now, an interesting question is, how far can you push this line of questioning? Here is a person who's perfectly lucid, mentally alert, intelligent, telling you that her paralyzed left arm is fine, it's working, it's moving, right? How is this possible? So the question is, how far can you push this? Now, physicians are generally reluctant to do this for fear of precipitating what neurologists call a catastrophic reaction. That is simply medical jargon. It means the patient starts crying, breaks down and starts crying, okay? But I thought, what the hell, let me try it anyway. Let me ask her. So the question is, what if you actually say, look, your arm is not moving. You look at it, your arm is not moving. So why are you telling me it's moving? What if you confront the patient? What will happen? So I said, Mrs. D, can you move your arms? She said, yes. Can you move both your arms? Yes. Are both arms equally strong? She said, oh, they're equally strong, doctor. Okay? And then I said, okay, touch my nose with your right hand. And she does that. Remember, her right arm is fine, it's not paralyzed. I said, touch my nose with your left arm. She doesn't do anything, her left arm is paralyzed. I said, Mrs. D, are you touching my nose? She said, yes. And I said, can you see yourself touching my nose? She said, oh yes, it's sort of about an inch from your nose. She produces a complete fabrication, what we call a confabulation. She's almost hallucinating her hand touching my nose. Now, why would this happen? It's not merely a denial of paralysis. The patient will actually assert that the paralyzed arm does not belong to her. She'll say, doctor, what is this arm doing in my bed? And again, this is familiar to most of you, but just to refresh your memory, you take the patient, grab hold of her hand, her paralyzed, lifeless left hand, which is lying on her lap, raise it, and said, what is this? Instead of saying it's my left hand, that's what most people do. You show this, she say, doctor, that's your hand, doctor. On one occasion, the patient told me, doctor, that's my brother's hand. So this woman is telling me it's my brother's hand. I said, why do you say that? She said, oh, it's big and hairy, doctor. Now, initially you think the patient is crazy. Why would she say her left hand belongs to her brother? But remember what I said earlier, the patient is not crazy. You can talk to her mentally quite lucid. Any other topic under the sun, you can talk to her, she's quite normal. But anything concerning her left arm, you say, what is this? She says, oh, it's my brother's left arm. It's my father's left arm. Okay? Now that's very rare. Much more commonly, the patient will just deny that the arm is paralyzed. Now, question is, what happens if you cross-examine the patient? Pretend you're a lawyer and say, look, why isn't the left arm working? And as I said, if you do this, the patient will continue to deny the paralysis, even in the face of contradictory evidence. The patient can clearly see that the arm is not moving, but is denying that it's paralyzed. Why does this happen? Now, I remember seeing this phenomenon, and the phenomenon of somatoparaphrenia, where the patient says, this arm doesn't belong to me, and saying to myself, this has to be the most fascinating phenomenon in all of neurology. Indeed, in all of medicine, or you might say in all of science. Here is an adult human being, perfectly intelligent, lucid, can carry on a conversation with you, not psychotic or emotionally disturbed, telling you that her paralyzed left arm belongs to her mother, or to her brother, or to you. Okay, so why does this happen? This got me thinking about Freud, about psychoanalysis, and about why denial occurs. And we really have two questions to answer here. Okay? One question is, why does anybody engage in denial? These types of Freudian defense mechanism. So let me backtrack here and say something, and that is, the kind of denial you see in Mrs. D, where she says my left hand is touching your nose, that is rare. More commonly, what the patient will do is engage in a sort of resort to all kinds of tricks to try and avoid confronting the paralysis. These are the so-called Freudian defense mechanisms. So for example, I would examine a patient. I would say, touch my nose with your right hand. Touch my nose with your left hand. Mrs. D, I don't want to touch your nose. I'm sick and tired of all these medical students prodding me all day. I'm very tired, doctor. I don't want to touch your nose. I don't want to touch your nose. She instantly produces a rationalization. On another occasion, Mr. D, can you touch my nose with your right hand? Touch my nose with your left hand. No movement. Mrs. D, what are you doing? Doctor, I have severe arthritis in my left shoulder. You know that. As a doctor, I can't move my left arm. Severe arthritis in the left arm. Okay? And the best one was when I asked this retired Air Force pilot, can you move your right arm? Yes. Show me. Do it with your left hand. Why aren't you touching my nose? Doctor, I belong to the Air Force. I'm not accustomed to taking orders from anybody. I'm not accustomed to taking orders from anybody. Okay? A beautiful example of a Freudian rationalization. You also get other phenomena like repression. I'm sure everybody here knows what repression is. If there is some unpleasant memory, it's very hard to dredge it up into consciousness, to use Freudian terminology. Something that's threatening to your ego and self-esteem, you tend to play it down, you tend to ignore it, you tend not to bring it up to the surface of consciousness. And again, we all engage in denials, but this is floridly amplified in these patients. So for example, you go to a patient, and this is an experiment we tried, and to my knowledge it's not been tried before. So here's a patient vehemently denying that his left arm is paralyzed. Now one of the most striking things about anosognosia is, it's one of the few neurological syndromes from which there is complete recovery, typically, after a few days. So 2 days, the patient is completely denying her left arm is paralyzed. You go back the third day, the patient is completely out of the denial. She's still paralyzed. The stroke has produced a damage to the internal capsule, the left arm is still paralyzed, and you ask the patient, can you use your right hand? Yes. Can you use your left hand? No, doctor, it's paralyzed. So the patient has come out of the denial. And this is true of a majority of patients. After a week or two, they're completely out of the denial. Sometimes in just a day or two. Okay, this raises an interesting question. Every day you go there, she's saying that. Then you go, she's now recovered, and you say, what did you tell me yesterday when I asked you about your arm? She's going to say, my God, why was I telling you that my arm was fine? What is he going to tell you? And this simple experiment had not been done. This is the amazing thing about neurology. So we tried this. We've tried this on several patients. On 2 of the patients we tested, the amazing result was that when we asked the patient, after a week of denial, the patient comes out of the denial spontaneously. We go to the patient, we say, can you use your right arm? Yes. Can you use your left arm? No, my left arm is paralyzed. What did you ask me yesterday when I asked you this question? The patient answered the same thing. I told you it was paralyzed. What do you mean? She is denying her denial. Okay? It means it's almost as if she's rewriting the script to match the current belief system. There is no way in which she can reconcile her current view of herself and of her body with the vehement denials she was engaging in for the last several days. And therefore she rewrites the entire script. And this is telling you something very important about how all of us write the scripts of our lives. And that's where I'm headed in this lecture. Okay? Now all of this raises intriguing questions, and it raises 2 questions. One question is, why does anybody engage in denial? Okay? As I said, we all engage in denial, but these people do it in a floridly exaggerated manner. And we've gone through a list of the types of Freudian defense mechanisms they all engage in. We talked about outright denial. We talked about confabulation, where the patient says, I can see my hand touching your nose. A hallucination almost. We talked about repression. I just told you the patient is denying her denials. Repressing the memory of her own denials. Okay? You also see what's called reaction formation. That is asserting the opposite of what you know to be true about yourself. Now this may sound like psychological mumbo jumbo, so let me explain what I mean. So I go to the patient and I say, can you move your right arm? Yes. Can you use your right hand? Yes. Can you use your left hand? Yes. Are they equally strong, Mrs. D? Oh, they're equally strong, doctor. Okay, can you lift that big mahogany table with your right hand? Yeah, I can lift it. How far do you think you can lift it? Oh, I can lift it about 3 inches, I think. It's a huge, big, heavy table. And she says, I can lift it 3 inches. What about your left hand? Oh, I can lift it 6 inches with my left hand, doctor. Now, why would she say that? Why would any normal person say that? It's as though somebody in there knows that she's paralyzed. And she's actually trying to disguise it by saying, no, my left hand can lift it. Now, she's not lying deliberately. Okay, she's lying to herself. And this is why you call it self-deception. And this raises a fascinating question. That is, why does anybody engage in denial? Why do all of us do it all the time in our daily lives? Now, we don't realize it. That was Freud's point. All of these mechanisms are unconscious. They're mechanisms we have evolved to quote-unquote defend the ego, whatever that means. And I'll talk about that in a short while. But the question is, why do normal people engage in denial, rationalization, repression, confabulation, all of these mechanisms? After all, it's better to confront the truth. To thine own self be true, as somebody said, Shakespeare said. Okay, it's better to confront the truth, have a realistic picture. So why do we engage in all of these psychological tricks to defend the ego, as Freud said? The second question is, why are these defense mechanisms grotesquely, floridly amplified in these patients with anosognosia with right parietal damage? So you've got 2 questions to answer. So let's tackle each of them in turn. So first I'd like to present some theoretical speculations on anosognosia, raise some questions, and then I'll talk about some experiments we've done on anosognosia, because we are scientists and we don't want to just speculate as philosophers might do. We also want to do experimental work, and that's what this conference is all about. Okay, so first let's address the question of why anybody, normal people, engage in these mechanisms. Let nobody tell you that they don't. I mean, in fact, people vehemently assert that they don't do this. But that's another example of denial. Okay? Okay? So it's sort of, in fact, as I tell my students, denial is extremely common. You think it's a very rare psychological disturbance you see in patients with brain damage. It's very common, because if I do a survey on an undergraduate population, or in fact on all of you here, and you ask people, what is your IQ? Is your IQ above average or below average? You find 95% of people say, in fact 98% of people say their IQ is above average. Now this is mathematically impossible, just think about it, because IQ by definition is the mean of the population. So half the population, the IQ is actually below average. But 98% of people say their IQ is above average. This means half of mankind is in denial about its stupidity. They don't realize that the IQ is below average. Okay? So it's a very common phenomenon, and actually not that different from anosognosia if you think about it. You see this florid pathology in these patients denying their paralysis. It's not fundamentally different from half the population denying that they're stupid. Okay? All right. Now, I'm sort of going off on a tangent here, so let me get back to the main question: why do people engage in denial? And one view proposed by Trivers, the evolutionary psychologist, because in biology and in neurology and in psychology, when you look at any phenomenon that seems mysterious or strange, first think of evolution, because as Dobzhansky said, nothing in biology makes any sense except in the light of evolution. And if you think of neurology as a branch of biology, after all, brain is a biological origin, brain is a biological organ, obviously, if you have mental traits, you have to ask the evolutionary question of why these mental traits, these propensities evolved. And one example is denial. Denial in some sense is maladaptive. Supposing I'm paralyzed and I think I'm not paralyzed, it's not adaptive. You're not confronting the truth about yourself. So why would something that looks maladaptive have evolved? Why can't people be more truthful about themselves? And Trivers has a very ingenious solution to this. And as you know, he's one of the founding fathers of evolutionary psychology. So tremendously influential scientist, brilliant scientist, used to be at Harvard and now he's at University of California, Santa Cruz. His idea was the following. He said the reason people engage in denial is the following. Okay? First of all, let's talk about lying. All people lie, believe it or not. Right? Except what? Even Yudhishthira, lied on occasion, right? So all people lie. We lie, people lie during tax audits. People lie during courtship, So why do people engage in lies? But the problem is, according to Trivers, when you lie, it's very easy for the person listening to you to detect that you're lying because your face leaks deception. If you smile, for example, a genuine smile involves more muscles and different set of muscles than a fake smile. When I do a fake smile, typically the upper part of the face does not participate, and Ekman and others have shown that it's possible if you're a trained observer to tell a fake smile apart from a real smile. So in fact, there's a Red Queen strategy going on in evolution between the need to deceive people on occasion, human beings are the Machiavellian primate, and the need to detect deception. When is this chap lying? Okay? So Trivers says, the reason you evolved the ability to deceive yourself is because then, if you convince yourself of the lie, then you can tell somebody this, and you already believe it, then that person won't know you're lying. That's why it evolved. To give you a concrete example, I'm a chimp junior, and I found this big batch of bananas, and I'm getting ready for a big feast. The alpha male, I detect the alpha male in the vicinity. So what do? I hide the bananas under the log. And the alpha male comes in and says, where are the bananas? Now if I point to this, of course he's going to eat it, I'm not going to get it. So I have to lie to me. So I tell him, oh, they're over there, about a mile away. So he goes away. Trouble is he can detect from my expression that I'm lying. So what is Trivers' solution? I lie to myself. I start believing, they're over there. Then when I lie to him, I deceive him effectively, and he won't know that I'm lying. Hence the evolution of self-deception. This argument I don't buy. And anyone here, I'm sure, sees the flaw in the argument. I think there is some truth to this argument. I'm not denying it completely. But it can't be the whole story for one simple reason. Supposing the chimp believes, let's say you're the chimp, and you now believe that the bananas are under the table, under the log. And the alpha male comes and asks you, where are the bananas? And you convince yourself they're not here, they're out there, a mile away, and you lie to him. He goes away, fine. But then when you wanted to look for the bananas, you would go and look there instead of here. In other words, self-deception defeats the whole purpose of lying. The whole purpose of lying is that you still have access to the truth, but you withhold the truth from some other individual. But if you don't have access to the truth anymore, if you've blocked it, it defeats the whole purpose of lying. So this seems to be an internally contradictory situation. Okay? And what it also suggests is what we call belief and truth is not a single valued thing. It's a many layered thing, belief. And therefore you can have denial at one level and lack of denial at another level. And these things need to be probed experimentally if you really want to understand human nature. And anosognosia gives us an opportunity for doing that. So then you ask me, okay, Trevor's argument cannot be right, at least not in the simple form that I've stated it. That is, you engage in denial in order to lie to somebody. Okay, that argument doesn't work. So what is the purpose of denial? What is the purpose of Freudian mechanisms? Now I'd like to propose a completely different idea, and that is based on hemispheric specialization. Remember, denial occurs most often when the right hemisphere is damaged. With the left hemisphere damaged, you get same kind of paralysis of the right side, but you do not engage in denial. You say, my God, when am I going to get better? Doctor, I'm paralyzed. And this gives you an important clue to what the answer might be. Okay? One view of denial, by the way, is a Freudian view. The reason the woman is denying her paralysis or the man is denying his paralysis, because it's unpleasant. You don't want to admit something unpleasant to yourself. Now, this is not an explanation. It's circular. Okay? It's like saying the reason sex feels, you do engage in sex is because it feels good. That's not an explanation. You have to say, why does it feel good? It's because it allows you to transmit your genes to the next generation, right? So similarly, saying that you engage in denial just to protect your ego or something is not a complete explanation, right? So why do people engage in denial? Why do people engage in Freudian mechanisms? Simply saying they do this because it's unpleasant. Paralysis is unpleasant and you're just covering it up is not an adequate explanation of what's going on. It's a tautology, really. Okay, so why do people do it? So the clue comes from hemispheric specialization. The fact that you only see denial, mostly see denial of the right hemisphere paralysis, you don't see it with left hemisphere damage as often. So this gives you the clue. The answer lies in hemispheric specialization. If you look at, so let's talk about what goes on when you walk around the world. You encounter sensory impressions, form new beliefs. You're constantly revising your views on the world and about yourself. What I call the belief system. Okay, your belief system, what you believe to be true about the world and about yourself in that world. And as you encounter new events, you fold this new information into the pre-existing belief system. And the belief system becomes more and more elaborate and more sophisticated. Now, what happens if a new item of information comes in that's inconsistent with the belief system? What do you do then? Well, usually when there's a new item of information coming in, you accommodate it in the pre-existing framework. But what if it doesn't fit? Well, one option is to completely tear down the belief system, start from scratch. Okay? Unfortunately, if every time there's a little discrepancy, if you completely rewrite the whole script, this would lead to complete chaos, instability of behavior. Therefore, you've evolved a mechanism whereby when there's a small discrepancy, you say, what is the likelihood that this discrepancy is important? Given my entire belief system, it's challenging my belief system, let me ignore it. The sort of thing that scientists do, okay? Cling to the original paradigm and resist paradigm shifts when there is an anomaly. To use Thomas Kuhn's expression, when there's an anomaly, something that doesn't fit, typically you engage in denial. And this is to preserve stability of behavior. That's the argument. And this tendency to cling to your belief system, preserve the status quo, and engage in all these Freudian mechanisms, all of that, I claim, is done by the left hemisphere, primarily. Okay? And is intimately linked to language, although not exclusively dependent on language. Okay, so what is the right hemisphere doing? The argument is, there's a limit to the extent to which you can do this. If there's a minor discrepancy, it makes sense to engage in denial, to pretend it doesn't exist statistically. And you say, let me forge ahead. I can't be sounding off alarm bells every time there's a little discrepancy. Because then, as I said, your behavior will be unstable. But if the discrepancy becomes very large, then you need some mechanism, some kind of surveillance to say, my God, You can't keep clinging to your pre-existing belief. It's time to start from scratch, rewrite the entire script. And that's where the right hemisphere kicks in. It makes you orient to this new anomaly and makes you generate a paradigm shift in your mental state. Okay? So the argument is that in anosognosia, the right hemisphere is damaged, so the left hemisphere is free to engage in all its confabulations, denials, repressions, all of these mechanisms, which Freud said are defending the ego, and I'm not disagreeing with him, but I'm trying to fit this into an evolutionary argument. The purpose is to confer stability on behavior, coherence and continuity in your behavior. Okay? But when the anomaly or discrepancy reaches a certain threshold, when it becomes large enough, the right hemisphere alerts you to this and says, look, it's time to completely revise your hypothesis, start from scratch. When that mechanism is damaged, there is no limit to the delusions that the patient will engage in. My left arm is touching your finger. I can lift the table 6 inches with my left arm. There is almost no limit to the extent to which the patient will engage in denial, confabulation, rationalization. I think that's what's going on in these patients. Now, this is fine as a sort of overarching theoretical framework, but how do you approach the problem experimentally? And that's really my main message today, that anosognosia and other neurological syndromes provide an experimental foothold for approaching some of these deeply enigmatic aspects of human nature, but very important aspects of human nature, such as Freudian psychology. Denial, rationalization, repression, confabulation, all of these mechanisms. You can actually begin to do experiments that Freud could only have dreamed of, and then you can combine these experiments with imaging studies on the brain. So let me give you an example of an experiment on anosognosia. One standard view of anosognosia, which goes back to the older neurology literature, these patients have right hemisphere damage, and they also have neglect typically. They tend to ignore everything on the left side. So maybe they're just indifferent to the paralysis. They just don't notice that the arm is paralyzed. This is a view that many physicians hold. Now, to test this, we did a very simple experiment. There are several experiments. I'll just mention one or two. Okay, the theory is this chap is denying the paralysis because he simply doesn't notice it. Okay? He's ignoring everything on the left side, ignoring the fact that the left arm is paralyzed. We had a cardboard box with an arrangement of mirrors and gloves called the Nielsen box. And using this Nielsen box, you can trick somebody. Any person, anybody here in the audience can come and sit here on the chair, and I put the Nielsen box here, and you put your gloves on your two hands, white gloves on your two hands, put your hands inside the box, and look at your own gloved hand. Okay, you can have the right hand or you can have the left hand. And then you get the metronome going and ask the student to move his right hand up and down or his left hand up and down to the metronome, to the rhythm of the metronome. And then you look inside the box, you see your hand going up and down. So far, so good. Then what happens is you have your assistant under the table wearing a glove. Okay? You ask him to close his eyes briefly. The experimental subject, the student, is asked to close his eyes briefly. And during that period, a mirror flips into the box, which the student is not aware of. And the undergraduate assistant puts his hand through the back of the box without the student's knowledge. Okay? So the assistant is below the table, puts his gloved hand inside. Now the student looks inside the box. He's actually looking at the assistant's gloved hand, not his own hand. Okay? But he thinks he's looking at his own hand because of just optics. Now you get the metronome going and tell him, do the same thing, move your hand up and down. When you do this, of course, you whisper to the student, don't move your hand. So he's issuing commands from his brain to move his hand, but what does he see when he looks in the box? Perfectly stationary hand. Now we've tried this on several colleagues. They instantly get a big jolt. They say, my God, what's going on? Never in their wildest dreams would they have imagined that you've hidden an undergraduate under the table, with wearing a glove. So people get a jolt. Sometimes they think they're going crazy. They register surprise, astonishment. They're perplexed, disturbed. We tried this on a patient with anosognosia. So he's looking at his own normal hand. okay, his normal right hand, which is moving fine, and we tried this experiment. We got the metronome going, the undergraduate puts his hand there, he looks inside, we tell the undergraduate, don't move your hand. So the patient is now looking at his normal hand, but you have optically paralyzed the patient's normal hand. He looks inside, and when the metronome goes, he does not see his arm going up and down as it should. What does he do? Normal people get a jolt. They say, my God, what's going on? The patient calmly says, I see it moving up and down, doctor. They don't register surprise. They produce a confabulation. Now remember, this is his right hand. You have artificially paralyzed his right hand. And he is denying that artificial optical paralysis of his right hand. That means it cannot just be because he's ignoring the left side of the world. What it means is he is now denying the artificial paralysis of his right hand. Now ordinarily a person registers this discrepancy, this anomaly, and says, my God, what's going on? This patient's brain is unable to register that discrepancy, that florid discrepancy in the sensory input. And I claim that that's the main problem in anosognosia. So the right frontoparietal region, which is damaged in this patient and other patients whom we have tested, is involved in monitoring discrepancies between visual and somatosensory inputs. When that's damaged, he's no longer able to do it. So it's not merely an indifference to the left side of the world. Now, when we proposed this several years ago, it was of course very speculative, but recently Ray Dolan and Chris Frith and others at University College have done experiments on normal human volunteers doing PET scans using mirrors. And they found something very interesting. That is, if you have a discrepancy between vision and somatic sensations, it doesn't matter where the discrepancy is coming from, left side or right side, it's always the right frontoparietal region that lights up, strongly supporting our idea that there's a mechanism here that's involved in surveillance and picking up discrepancies. So it's a lovely example of how you can do experiments on patients and then go and do imaging experiments on normal people and show that some such mechanism does indeed exist and try and precisely localize that mechanism in a specific part of the brain. Let me give you another example of an experiment we did, again very simple. I walked up to the patient. Here's a patient whose left arm is completely paralyzed, has been paralyzed for 2 weeks, and he's saying it's working fine, it's touching your nose and all of that. So I walked up to him and I said, why did you just move your left arm and scratch your nose? Or why did you just point to me with your left arm? I asked him an absurd question. Why did you just point to me with your left hand? And if I ask you that, you're smiling, okay? More typically, somebody will say, no, I didn't do that. What do you mean? What are you talking about? They won't understand what I'm talking about. And I've tried this on colleagues. They'll just look startled or look surprised. If I suddenly came and said, why are you scratching your nose? You won't know what I'm talking about. The patient said, I said, why are you moving your left? He says, oh, because my elbow was uncomfortable, so I had to move it. Instantly comes up with an excuse. Now this is very important because again it's telling you anosognosia is a disorder of belief. It's not a sensory disorder. His whole belief about himself and about his body scheme has been altered as a result of this right frontoparietal damage. And we could go on like this. We've done several experiments and we're running short of time, but I'll tell you one or two more. Another experiment is where you tell the patient, what if you reward the patient for telling you the truth? That is, remember I said a number of experiments suggest that somebody in there knows that he or she is paralyzed. Why would the patient say, I can lift the table 6 inches with my left hand? Okay, if she genuinely thought her arm was fine, she would say, yeah, it's working. Why would she vehemently assert it can lift the table 6 inches? All of this suggests that somebody in there knows that the arm is paralyzed. So the question is, even though the patient is denying she's paralyzed, is that knowledge about the paralysis available somewhere in the brain, but the access to that knowledge is blocked? Or does the knowledge simply not exist? How do you operationally distinguish between these two possibilities? So we did a couple of experiments. We had a cocktail tray with glasses on it of champagne, and we said, pick up the tray. Now, a normal person picks up the tray like this. Correct? A patient who's paralyzed, left arm is paralyzed, or if I take one of you and tie up your left hand and say, lift the tray, you do this, you go to the middle of the tray and pick it up to the center of gravity. You don't go here like this. What does the patient do? The answer is the patient goes straight to the right side, does this, the glasses topple. He says, oh my God, how clumsy of me. Doesn't notice that the left arm failed to do its job. Okay? Another example, what if you reward the patient for telling you the truth? You say, Mrs. D, I'm giving you 2 tasks. If you put the light bulb on the lamp, I'll give you $5. If you tie the shoelaces on this little child's shoe, I'll give you $10. If I tried it on any one of you, which one would you pick? Obviously, you'd pick the shoe. If I tied one of your hands behind you, and we have done this actually on patients with hemiplegia who are not in denial, who know that their left arm is paralyzed, who admit it's paralyzed, they immediately go for the light bulb because it's very difficult. By the way, there's a time limit. You have to do it in 10 seconds or whatever. If you go, it's very difficult to tie shoelaces with one hand. It takes ages. So the person goes straight for the light bulb because $5 is better than nothing, right? What happens to the anosognosic patient? The patient goes straight for the shoe, starts playing with the laces. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, no sign of frustration. Okay, finally you get frustrated and pull the shoe away. Go back after half an hour, repeat the experiment. Pick the bulb, Mrs. D, you get $5 right away. Pick the shoe, you'll get $10. Go straight for the shoe. Again, goes for the shoe, ties it. 3 times, 4 times in a row. So she's actually repressing her own failed attempts at tying the shoelace, going back for it repeatedly. Another example of Freudian repression. Okay? All of this says that this knowledge, if it's there, is very deeply embedded somewhere in the brain, and it's not accessible in any easy manner. I'll conclude with 2 more experiments and then we're done. And this actually is a pretty strange result which we got. And I want to emphasize that it's an experiment we've done on only 1 patient, and it may not hold up, so it needs to be repeated on more patients. And I'm hoping some of you here in the audience will go and try it on your patients, because I think it provides a valuable approach to this problem and the question of studying how beliefs are constructed by the brain. Okay? So in a sense, it's the first experiment that has ever been done on a Freudian belief system. So what we did was we had this patient. So the claim is that the left hemisphere is constructing this belief system about the person, about his body, and about the arm not being paralyzed, and it's clinging to the pre-existing belief system. That's why the patient is denying that the arm is paralyzed, because you don't want to admit it to yourself. If that theory is correct, what if I take this patient who's now denying that his left arm is paralyzed, and what if I make the paralysis more acceptable to him? Now, how do you do that? I mean, there's nothing more disturbing than paralysis, short of death. Complete paralysis of one side of the body. How do you make this acceptable to the patient? And the question is, will they then stop denying? How do you do this? So we hit on the idea of just going to the patient. So I took a syringe full of saline, okay, which doesn't do anything. Went up to the patient and I said, look, Joe, I'll just call him Joe. Look, Joe. So I've gone to Joe several times. Can you move your right hand? Yes. Can you move your left hand? Yes. Are they equally strong? Yes. Can you touch my nose with your right hand? Yes. Can you touch it with my left hand? Yes, I'm touching it. I can see it. All of the usual testing. And he's been doing it for days. Now I walk in and I say, Joe, I'm going to do some neurological testing. He said, you already did that. I said, yeah, I'm going to do some more testing. This time I'm going to examine your reflexes and all of that. And after that, I'm going to do this simple clinical test of injecting this paralyzing anesthetic in your left arm to completely paralyze your arm for a few minutes. And then you'll be fine. Is that okay? So the idea was, now he thinks it's part of the neurological testing that his arm is paralyzed. Will he then admit it's paralyzed? Okay? Or will he continue to say, no, it's moving, it's not paralyzed? Now, as I said, we've done this only on 1 or 2 patients with mixed results, so it needs to be done on a systematic basis with many patients, but it provides a valuable new approach to experimentally studying anosognosia. And here I also have to acknowledge there are other colleagues of mine who've done experiments in this field, very elegant experiments, especially Marcel Kinsboon and Tony Marcel. And I don't have time to describe their experiments, but you can look it up on the web. But here is an experiment we did on the construction of beliefs by these patients. So I tried this on my first patient. I walk in and I said, Mr. D, I'm sorry, I said Jim. Jim, did I say Jim or James? I can't remember. Joe, right, Joe. So you go to Joe, this is a problem with using names which are too common, you know. So I go to Joe and I say, Joe, can you use your right hand? Yes. Can you use your left hand? Yes. Are they equally strong? Yes. Okay. Now I'm going to do some neurological testing on you. Is that okay? Sure. So I test his reflexes, cranial nerves, and then I say, Joe, as part of this exam, I have to inject this anesthetic. He says, oh, really? He says, yes, but don't worry. I'm going to inject it in your left arm. It's a local anesthetic. It'll last for a few minutes. Your arm will be paralyzed. He says, okay. Right? So I do this on my first patient. I go there and I say, I'm going to inject this paralyzing agent in your left arm. It'll be paralyzed for a few minutes. Is that okay? He looks at me straight in the eye and he says, but doctor, is that fair? My God. How am I supposed to react to this? I realized I had sort of stepped into the twilight zone. The guy says, is that fair? You're changing the rules of the game, is what he was implying. Okay? So I said, I'm going to stay away from this. So I went to the next patient, and I did the same thing. Can you use your right hand? Yes. Can you use the left hand? Yes. Are they equally strong? Yes. Okay, I'm going to do a neurological test. I'm going to inject your left arm with this paralyzing agent. The patient says, fine. Okay, and it's going to be paralyzed. He says, okay, that's fine. So I take the saline, inject it, and I said, Mrs. D, can you move your left arm? No, I can't. It's paralyzed. So now that you've made the paralysis more acceptable to her, she's willing to confess that the arm is paralyzed and it's not moving. Now immediately you will respond, how do you know that's not just because you're a charismatic physician and you've just hypnotized her? You've just come and it's just, you know, she's very suggestible and she's just telling you what you want to hear. So we did the control experiment. What would that be? After the next day I went back and I said, Mrs. D, I'm going to now inject your right arm with the paralyzing. Do the same test. Can you use your right arm? Yes. Can you use your left arm? Yes. She's now back in denial. So now I'm going to inject this anesthetic. She said, you already did that. I said, fine, but I'm going to do it in your right arm. She said, fine. Okay? Now remember, she doesn't have any denial of paralysis of her right arm. So I injected her right arm. Of course, it still moves. And I said, Mrs. D, can you move your arm? She said, yeah, of course it's moving. I said, how is that possible? She says, I don't know, your anesthetic doesn't work. Or on another occasion, she said, mind over matter. Okay? Something they make up. So this shows that the result of the first experiment was valid, and it's not just because she's suggestible. She's now telling her, no, your anesthetic doesn't work. Experiments of this kind, there are many experiments one could talk about, I think are suggesting strongly that we can now develop a bridge, develop links, conceptual links, between neurology and psychiatry, or indeed even between neurology and psychoanalysis. And these, I can't emphasize how important this enterprise is, even though the results are very preliminary and a great deal of more work needs to be done, because you're really looking at human nature through a magnifying lens in these patients. It's almost, I shouldn't say this because it's tragic in a way, but it's also comical watching some of these patterns of behavior and what they tell you. Almost comical when that Air Force pilot told me, Doctor, I'm not accustomed to taking orders from people. It's almost comical looking at this facetious remarks, quasi-humorous remarks made by these patients to deny the paralysis. Even though it's tragic, it's comical watching this because it's an instant replay of an amplified, a comically amplified version of the kinds of denials, confabulations that we all engage in, what we call life. So what I'm arguing is that the enterprise Freud began in the late 19th century, what he called a project for a scientific psychology. At that time, maybe it was premature. But now, given all the new imaging technology that's available to study different parts of the brain, both in normal people and in patients, and by doing the right kinds of experiments on selected patient populations, for example with anosognosia, and instead of treating them like curiosities, which is what people have done in the past, you can do systematic experiments on these patients. And you can always begin with single case studies, looking at one patient, doing detailed experiments on one patient, and then see if the same result holds for other patients. By doing this, you can begin to actually address these lofty questions about denial and confabulation and all of these questions about human nature, which people have been thinking about for over 100 years, but not really understood what the neural machinery in the brain might be. We can now begin to do that. Thank you.